Tonight we're going to take a look at something really interesting that I think you'll enjoy. This is a Rollei cord rather, camera made by the Rollei company, which is a German manufacturer. This particular camera is pretty amazing from a technological standpoint, and the amount of features that were available on this camera. My father owned this camera. He purchased it in around 1955. That's kind of the best time reference we have when he started shooting pictures. He did all of our. I'm one of 5 kids, and he did all of our portraiture with this camera, and he shot a lot of pictures with it while we lived in Europe and in the States as well. But when we were in Germany, he became fascinated, of course, with German products and German engineering. He was an Air Force officer and was given access to a lot of German equipment. And of course, they're known for their superior technology, and particularly during that time frame, they built some amazing photographic equipment. So we're going to do an overview of this camera, how it works, kind of the basic features of it. I think you're going to find it really amazing. First of all, the Rollei company is a German company, had a worldwide reputation for building what actually was called a Rollei Flex camera. This happens to be a Rollei cord, and we're going to get into that momentarily, but the Rollei Flex and Rollei cord cameras were what are called twin lens reflex cameras, and that is they have 2 lenses on them. And the company was founded in 1920 as the Werkstatt für Mechanik und Optik Frank and Heidecke Company. And they started out making the twin lens cameras that we're going to be talking about today. The founders of the company were 2 gentlemen, Paul Franke and Reinhold Heidecke. And when we're going to get into the 2 models specifically. The interesting thing about this camera, this is a film camera. So the film that's actually used in this camera is quite large. So you would get these extremely high resolution images. We're just going to open it up, and to open the camera up, you pull this little lever here, and then you sort of prop it open. Let me just sort of get to here we go. So that's a side view. So we're looking at the front, the side, and I just manipulated this little lever here to get this to open. But if you look at it, the whole thing pops open, and in the back, you can clearly see there is an area here that's in fact 6 centimeters by 6 centimeters wide. And this little area is an amazing amount of space to put photographic data on, meaning with film, you're strictly using emulsion type film. But a 6 centimeter by 6 centimeter exposure is extremely large compared to other film cameras, even 35 millimeter camera, which was 3.5 centimeters. So a 35 millimeter camera with film would give you an image that's only about this wide. So like that by this. So roughly half the size of this image, which made this camera perfect for portraiture and extreme high resolution photography. Now, the interesting thing about this was when you loaded this camera, you started out with a roll of film, and the roll would fit into this little area here on this little spool. And I don't know if you can see this little feeder groove here, but you would put the film, take the roll of film in your hand, feed it into this little roller groove, and then you would simply get it started, and you'd sort of advance a little bit to get the roll going there, and then you would lay you would start out by taking the roll that you purchased, and you'd plop it into this space first, okay? and you would bring it out, you'd pull it out of the roll, and you'd bring it over to the little feeder groove, and you would start to feed it. And once you got it sort of fed, you wouldn't get it quite to the first exposure, but you would get it to where the starter tape was. Then you would close this, back up, turn this lever, and it was locked and obviously completely light tight, meaning no light could get in it. Then what you would do is you would advance the film. This counter would start at 0. Now, if there was film in there, obviously I don't have any 120 or 120 film. The 120 film actually is the 6 centimeter negative film that you would feed into it, and you would simply advance this, and the setting would go to 1, and you would get 12 photographs on a roll. So you would simply advance it every time you would advance to the next exposure. So there were 2 cameras that Rollei made in the very beginning, and that was this camera, which is the Rollei cord, and a little bit of a superior, a more superior or more advanced camera called the Rollei Flex. The Rollei Flex was the most advanced and expensive of the 2, and this model, the Rollei cord, was aimed at a slightly lower marketplace, but for advanced users, because it did have obviously the large exposure area film, and there are many other features that we're going to get to shortly for settings and exposure, shutter operation, etc., that made this camera an extraordinary piece of technology at the time. So when the founders created this camera, the reason why it has 2 lenses is very straightforward, and that is that this lens here is the lens that you are viewing your subject through. This lens, which is right below, is what's called the taker lens. This actually, when you operate the shutter for this particular lens here, it's what puts the picture on the film. This is merely for you to sort of size up the image and get it synced with the taker lens. So when you go to the top of the camera, we're just going to spin it around. I'll do a side view first. You pull this up, and it makes this magnificent sound when you open it too. Okay, so if you look into, imagine that you're holding the camera, you would actually be looking down into the top of the camera. And you can see, I'll just kind of point it towards that when you look into the overhead kind of periscope view, you can see my fingers in there through the mirror there, or through the lens. You're actually kind of sizing up your picture, and you're able to see essentially what the taker lens sees, because this lens is pointed slightly at a tilted angle, a little bit like that, and this is straight, so the 2 meet up literally almost directly in front of the camera, such that whatever you're viewing through here, through the viewfinder, and by the way, there's a little pop-up piece here, I'll pull it up. It's a little lens that sort of allows you to set your eye on it and get a magnified view of your subject matter. So it's kind of cool. You can flip that down if you just want to look directly into it overhead. And this kind of goes back to the day when you had a camera that with an antique camera that had like a daguerreotype or a metal plate, and the photographer would throw the piece of fabric over his head. This is kind of the same deal. You're looking down into the unit, or into the camera, at your subject, but you're looking through the finder lens. Now, the next thing you'd want to do if you were getting ready to take a photograph, obviously, would be to adjust the focus, and the focus knob is this knob right here. And you simply use this little gauge or this little reference um, setting or dial up here, and you set it based on your distance in feet. Okay, so for example, if you were 60 feet away from your subject and you have the uh, setting, we'll get to the film speed in a minute, but the film speed setting at, let's say, 8 ASA, then you would set it right there, and it would sort of, if you look at the front part of the camera, you'll see that whole piece moving in and out. And that is basically adjusting the focus. You really can't see by looking through the viewfinder there, but you would be going in and out of focus just by moving this knob. So this was how you focus the camera. So we'll just kind of set that back in place. Let me just open and close this a few times for you. Such a magnificent sound. That's just real precision fit and finish. As a matter of fact, speaking of fit and finish, this camera just has, I mean, for the time frame, and this piece was built in about 1955, 56, as we suspect. It's just amazing. The machining, the hand assembly, the level of detail, the precision. I mean, you're talking down to 1/10 of a millimeter tolerances here. So really something. So how did you take a picture? How did you take the camera outside? You have to remember that this camera was built way ahead of digital cameras, and there was no automatic adjustment for light. There was no automatic adjustment for shutter speed, all of that. You had to do that completely by hand. So this was targeted, again, at a very sophisticated, advanced photographic user or photographer. The golden era of this company was Rollei, was 1950 to 1963. Since then, by the way, the company's been purchased. It was first purchased by Samsung in Korea about 1995. I think that's when the German company and the descendant of Paul Frank, the original owner, I think his son and maybe even his grandson, they sold the business to Samsung. After that, it was subsequently sold off to a Danish company at some point. Nevertheless, the golden area for this company was 1950 to 1963. There was literally no competition for this camera and the two cameras, the Rollei Core and the Rollei Flex. There just wasn't any competition for it. In fact, every press photographer that was out in the field owned one of these cameras, not the Rollei Core, but the Rollei Flex. And the Rollei Flex was obviously the more sophisticated, and we'll get into that in a minute. There wasn't a whole lot of difference between the Rollei Flex and the Rollei Core, but one of the things that you would get with the more advanced version of this and the Rollei Flex was, instead of this knob for film advancement, you would have it was like a lever, and you would pop it out and you would just hand crank it. And that little hand crank did a bunch of different things. So you would take a shot, and then you would advance it to the next exposure. It would automatically reset the shutter for you. Let's get into this a little bit too. When you want to shoot a picture, and let's say that you want to shoot a picture of yourself and your dog, what you would do would be to take this switch right here, which that's the one setting, which is if you're standing behind the camera, you're just going to take an instant shot with no delay. You would set it to that M, and then you would take this lever, and it's spring loaded, so you would advance it and then get behind the camera, and you would hit that button. So I'll do it again. But let's say you wanted to do a, a little bit of a delay, a time, like we set 10 seconds, 3 seconds, or whatever on our iPhones or smartphones or cameras. You would simply move this lever to um, well, you can see it says M. I'll put it back to M, which is manual and basically just that's for your instant shot like we just did. But you push it down all the way to the middle section. Then you crank the shutter. Then you move it to the V position, and then you flip the shutter. What you'll do is flip the shutter and walk away. And it gives you about 10 seconds of delay before the photograph is taken. So and there you go. That little trip sound at the end was the shutter sound. So I'll do that one more time and just kind of hold the camera. So we've got it set. We're going to advance the film. Okay, and again on the Rollei cord, you had to do it by hand, and you had to bring it up to where it might say 2, 3, or exposure 4, or whatever. And once you get that locked, you would, let's say you want to take a picture of you and your 3 cats, or you and your girlfriend or boyfriend, you would simply arm the shutter, move this to that position, and you would turn this and you would walk away. Going to be about a 10-second span of time here, so let's just see. That's right, that shutter tripped at about 10 seconds. So that was how you took a 10-second walk away, get in front of the camera exposure. So pretty cool at the time. It was an option on a camera that you just did. Nobody else made it. That's what made this thing unique. So again, if you were a press photographer between 1950 and 1963, you would have not this camera, you'd have the slightly more advanced Rollei Flex. And it was so hugely popular that there were over 500 imitations of this camera. So people were knocking it off. And this was back in the day when you could knock something off and not go to prison for it for 10 years. But there were over 500 imitations. When my dad bought this camera in about 1956, 1 million of these Rollei cords had been sold. And again, these were targeted at amateur photographers, people who just everyday folks who wanted an advanced camera. This was the state-of-the-art camera, and you got the Rollei cord if you were really into it as a hobby or just personal use. If you were a pro and you were a press, media, whatever, you got the Rollei Flex, which was the updated model. Right around 1960, there was a really famous underwater photographer. His name was Hans Haas. Hans was trying to figure out a way to take underwater shots. And this was decades before there were, these cameras that you could buy for $200-300 that you could literally submerge in water without them becoming waterlogged or destroyed. He asked Rollei to develop a camera that you could take underwater. So they did that for him. It was called the Rollei Marine. It was spelled Rollellei, just like Rollei, and then Marine, Mrain, no E on the end. And that was just one of the products they created. The company itself kept plugging along till about 1960, when a company called Hasselblad caught the Rollei management people basically napping and produced a camera that was superior to the Rollei Flex. So it was just really, they got kind of fat and happy and just thought, nobody's going to mess with us. Let's just sit back. chill, and boom, somebody else produced something that was a little bit more advanced. But one thing I will add about the Rollei Flex, the pro camera version of this, the lenses, you've probably heard of a company called Zeiss. Zeiss makes absolutely the best optical lenses on the planet. The level of optics with Zeiss equipment is absolutely mind-boggling, amazing stuff. The Raleigh cord does not have Zeiss lenses. It has their own Frank and Heidecke lens. Even on the front here, you can see where it says Frank and Heidecke Braunschweig. And Frank and Heidecke built their own optical components, their own lenses for the Rollei cord. Now, for the Rollei Flex, you did get Zeiss lenses, and that was one of the drawing cards. If you were a pro, you were a press photographer, you definitely would get you'd want a Rollei Flex with the Zeiss lenses, because there was just nothing else like them. They were just absolutely so precise, deliver such high resolution that you had to have it. Some of the other features on both the Rollei Flex and the Rollei cord are this little dial on the left side of the camera. This little dial here is we take it for granted today, because all of our automatic cameras, if you buy like a Canon or a Nikon, all you do is point and shoot. It's automatically making these settings for you. And the settings that it's doing, and you can see this little numbered area up here where I'm turning the dial, is ASA, which is film speed. And you can see ASA right there on that, just against in front of my finger there. ASA. Oh, I'm hoping I get the camera, my camera lined up with this camera anyway. So the ASA was film speed, or the film's sensitivity to light, which you could adjust depending on whether you were in a shady spot, whether you were under a tree, whether you were in direct sunlight, whether you were inside. All of those elements could be controlled by your ASA. ISO, by the way, is another closely related term. It's just a different system of film speed. ISO is what we're all familiar with, because that's the system that's used for digital cameras. So ISO is kind of the same as ASA, but just a slightly different methodology. DIN is something that is also found on this camera. And DIN is simply, it's related to film speed, but it uses a scale in thirds of a stop. So it's a little bit less, I think it's less precise. But these three components, film speed and shutter diameter, in other words, the actual shutter opening, is like the iris on your eyeball. So when you move this, you're essentially opening and closing the shutter, what's called a leaf shutter, which is that shutter that just goes whoosh, just like the iris on your eye. And older cameras operate, with a mechanical lens or mechanical system with a leaf shutter system. So this just an amazing piece of equipment. And they're kind of, a lot of these were made. There were actually 2,699,505 of this particular camera, the Rollei cord, which appealed to the public masses, and the amateur but advanced skill set photographer made. So almost 3 million of these cameras were made. One interesting side note is that the Rollei company during World War II, they were in Germany, and obviously they were recruited by the German war machine to make other products. They also made binoculars, periscopes, sniper rifle sights, and other pieces of equipment. They even made some munitions, I believe. But you think that a company that was as technologically advanced would certainly be pulled in and required to build products for a war machine. So anyway, what an amazing piece of equipment. And it's something I'm really proud to have, that my dad owned. Put the lens cover back on there. The lens cover just kind of snaps in place. But there it is, kind of an overview of Rollei cameras and the Rollei cord piece itself. What a magnificent piece of technology. Thanks for watching. I hope this got you calmed down. I hope you get a great night's sleep. And if you liked the video, please indicate that you like it and subscribe to my channel for more interesting videos coming your way. Thanks a lot.